So today we're going to be talking about all-grain brewing, and more specifically about all-grain brewing using brew-in-a-bag, which for me is really a wonderful way of getting into all-grain brewing. It requires very little additional effort or equipment than what you might be using if you are used to using extract plus specialty grain brewing methods, which we spoke of not so long ago. Just a little bit about me, if you don't know. I'm the creator of the beginnerbrewer.com website. I'm also a regular columnist for On Tap magazine in their homebrew section. I do some sensory analysis for breweries and beer, and I judge in some competitions, and I work in the craft beer industry to help people make better processes, recipes, marketing happen. So I've been doing this for quite a while, and a lot of the things I share with people is really, or all of it is really based on my personal experience. I feel kind of strongly about that. I don't like telling people about things I haven't done myself or experimented with myself in terms of brewing. That and I'm a bit of a beer nerd, so I read a lot of the academic work published in the brewing industry. So it's like exciting journals like Food Science Technology and those sort of things, real good sleeping material. But you can learn a lot from the science and the research being done in the field. So just so that you know where it comes from. Okay, let's get started with the mantra, which some of you already know. It's a very good idea when you're going to brew beer to have a calm mind and a relaxed state. So don't get too anxious about beer and brewing because beer wants to be made. And I think today, more than perhaps any of the other webinars we've had, I hope to show you why I say that, because you really see the almost magical quality of beer when you start brewing all grain beer. That's really where you start seeing why beer wants to be made, because so many things sort of seem to slot together almost naturally for beer to be made. Some pros and cons. I did this slide last time when we spoke of extract and specialty grains to give you an indication of why I prefer that method as a beginning method rather than using kit brewing or even all grain brewing. So it's up to you where you start with this hobby. I mean, if some of you have already cut your teeth on either kits or specialty grain and extract brewing, then the natural progression would be all grain brewing. But you can also start with it. It's just a little bit more complex. But there's lots of advantages to this method of brewing. So first off, you have access to all the styles of beer. That's perhaps the greatest advantage. There is not a single style of beer you cannot brew using this method. Every single style you will find in guides like the BJCP or others will be open to you. And as I discussed last time, you can't always brew every single style using extract and specialty grains. Then you definitely have control over the flavor of the beer, more so than in any other method, the body of the beer, and we'll talk a little bit later about what I mean by that, as well as the sugar content of the beer, which is related to body. So you really have a great deal of control over that using all grain brewing. You also have a great deal of control over the foam and head retention you find in beer. Another thing which is a little bit tricky to do if you're using only extracts. Definitely more control over the color of beer. That's perhaps one of the least appreciated parts of all grain brewing. If there's one thing I don't much care for about using extracts and specialty grains is I don't have full control over the color of beer, because the extract usually is a little bit darker than I would want in malt, just because of the way it's been processed. And there's something, even some brewers know this term. It's the sort of extract burn, and that is if you boil very vigorously, sometimes extract can become a bit dark, and so your beer colors tend to be darker than what your recipe calls for. But in all grain brewing, that's not the case. You can really almost fine tune the color of beer, and I think the color of beer is important. It's part of the appreciation of a good beer is to nail the color properly so that it's a joy to look at as much as it is to taste. Definitely more cost effective than extracts. Weight for weight, 5 kgs of pale malt will cost you not at all as much as 5 kgs of dried malt extract. And so if you are cost conscious, I guess all grain is better. I'm always skeptical to talk about cost because I know for a fact that once you get into the brewing hobby and you really get passionate about it, the money you save on malts, you're definitely going to be spending somewhere else in the hobby itself. So it's all very relative, but yeah, it is definitely more cost effective, gram for gram. Some cons. I mean, you do need more equipment, but not that much more if you're going to do Brew-in-a-Bag, which we will be discussing today. And that's one of the great parts of Brew-in-a-Bag is it's really not very intensive on equipment. You can pretty much convert your existing rig, which you're using for extract and specialty grains, to Brew-in-a-Bag very, very easily. But there are more variables. So you are going to be using exactly the same process in a sense, not necessarily the same equipment or method, but the same process as commercial brewers. So you are controlling more variables, and of course, more things can go wrong when you do that. So you do need to be a little bit more careful when you brew. You have to be paying more attention to more variables. And definitely the other part, which is not always appreciated, is it definitely takes more time. As soon as you add mashing to the equation, which is the main thing which we're going to talk about today, it's going to take longer. With extract and specialty grains, you're really only adding about half an hour or so to the hour of boil through steeping those grains. In mashing, you could add up to an hour and a half of mashing and all the things which go with it. So if you're pressed for time and you want to do a quick brew, all-grain brewing is not necessarily the first method I would use. And in fact, I kind of vary between all-grain brewing and brewing with extracts and specialty grains, depending on how much time I've got. So if I know I've got a whole day ahead of me and I can just spend it brewing, all-grain brewing is the one I go for. If I want to quickly try a new recipe or test some sort of principle of brewing or experiment with something, and I only have an evening after work to do it in, I will often go for extract plus specialty grain method because it's so much quicker. Okay, let's go through the actual brewing process of all grain. Now, again, I don't know what your experience levels are. It's pretty much open to everybody, but it's useful to go through what it is we do when we brew beer, and especially focusing on all grain brewing. So for those of you who attended one of my first webinars, you'll be familiar with this picture, and I'll zip through it, but I want to focus on different elements than I did last time. So it all starts with barley or some kind of grain, which is malted and then mashed. And mashing is really the focus of all grain brewing. That's what makes it very different from extract brewing. And after mashing, you lauter, or lauter, probably the more correct way of pronouncing it. And that's where all grain brewing starts. You start literally at the very first step in brewing. So it's all up to you, basically. You are going to be creating your own extract, if you like, by extracting the sugars from the base malt. That's really what we're doing when we're mashing. And Brew-in-a-Bag is kind of nifty in the sense that it combines the two main processes here in this section of the brewing. Both the mash and the lautering is in the same vessel, and it happens inside the bag, and there's no additional sort of equipment needed as you may do if you're going to separate them out. You may have seen people using, let's say, converted coolers with sort of a false bottom and so on, and that requires those two steps to be separated. But in BIAB, Brew-in-a-Bag, you don't have to do that. It's actually one of the nicest parts of it. And these temperatures are not incidental. I'm going to go into them for a little bit more detail later, so we don't have to worry about it right now. But that's really the focus of what makes all grain different. Because once you get past the mashing and the lautering, the boil and everything else is exactly the same as you would do if you were to use extracts plus specialty grains. Because now you've just made your own extract, if you like, and you're going to add your hops and other ingredients, and you're going to whirlpool, and then you're going to go into the cold side of brewing, which is where you're going to chill your wort. This is where kit brewing starts, which is kind of why I don't much care for it. And then the fermentation is the same. You add your yeast, you're going to condition and carbonate it, and then finally bottle your beer or keg it, depending on your need. So all the other steps are really the same, and that's why in the previous webinar I have said it's important to learn the basics of brewing, because even if you start with extract and specialty grains, you're learning those basics. Much of it is the same with all grain brewing. So it's don't feel pressurized to convert to all-grain brewing if you're using extracts and specialty grains. If you're still learning, keep on learning. Keep on making beer until you really feel you've nailed it, and then you can always move to all-grain brewing. All-grain brewing is not necessarily better. It gives you more control. Like I said, it's got some real pros. But in my experience, when people go to all-grain brewing too quickly without knowing the basics, they can end up making some pretty bad beer. And that might discourage you from continuing in the hobby, even if you feel, wow, this is just too difficult. I can't possibly make beer. So it's a balancing act, I guess, but just keep that in mind. Again, if you have any questions throughout, please drop them in the chat and I'll address them at the end. Let's get into the basics of mashing. This really is what makes all-grain brewing. Let's first start with some important concepts. So I do apologize. There are some jargony things here which we'll have to cover, and I'm hoping that I can make it as painless as possible. Maybe it's time now for you to take a long sip of your beer if you have one in front of you, because it does get a little bit heavy, the terminology. I hope not, but let's see. So the first thing to understand is base grains. A base grain is a grain which contains mostly starch, which will eventually be converted into sugar through mashing. Okay, that's what makes a base grain a base grain. It's also the source of enzymes which actually help catalyze this whole conversion. And that, again, that's really the primary reason why I say beer wants to be made. Base grains already have enzymes inside of them to help convert starch into sugar. And that's why if you taste base grains, if you take a handful of pale malt or Pilsner malt or anything like that, and you taste it, it won't taste sweet because there is, at that stage, no sugar in it. It's mostly just starch. It actually can taste rather unpleasant, to the palate. And your role as the brewer in mashing will be to convert those starches into sugar. Specialty grains is what many of you are familiar with if you've attended my previous webinars. These are grains that through different kinds of processes already have sugar in them. So the process of creating a specialty grain would often have converted the starch into sugar, or that it will be roasted. In other words, it will change and caramelize. The sugar's already in place. And it often has almost no or minimal enzymes because of that processing. So for instance, if you roast a grain, you kill the enzymes in doing so. So there will be no enzymes available in that grain. Kill is probably not the right word. Enzymes are technically not alive. But yeah, you will disintegrate them and destroy them. And that's true for dried malt extract, by the way. You might see that if you buy dried malt extract, it will often say things like non-diastatic. And that is a very jargony word for contains no enzymes. Because in creating malt extract, you are also destroying the enzymes. Adjuncts are often seen as non-malted grains or non-barley grains, which often also need to be mashed to convert their starches into sugar. So a good example of that would be something like maize and a few other grains which have very low, sorghum is a good example as well. They've got very little enzyme inside of them. And so on their own, it's not enough for them to convert starch into sugar. And the way you would then help that along is to mash them along with a pale malt, for instance, or Pilsner malt, which has a lot of enzymatic action, and it actually has a surplus. So it releases so much enzyme into the mash that there's enough left over to also convert things like adjuncts, maize, and others like sorghum and so on, rye and other adjuncts as well, to convert those starches into sugar. So it's a very useful thing to know about. If you want to brew beer with different grains and you're using all grain methods, you often will combine them with typical base grains like pale malt or Pilsner malt, which has a lot of enzymatic action to help that along. Otherwise, what will happen is you'll just end up with starch in the beer, and that's not pleasant. You don't want too much starch in any beer. It's just not going to taste very nice, and it's going to cause a very hazy beer amongst many other problems. And I've mentioned diastatic. So the simplest definition of this is the one I've got on the screen. It really is just a measure of the available conversion enzymes in any given grain. So some grains are known to have very high diastatic power. Things like Pilsner malts are specifically bred and created through the processing they go through to be very high in diastatic power. And that's also what's referred to as a very well converted. You may hear that a well modified grain. Well modified grain is another way of saying this grain is very high in diastatic power. It has a lot of enzymatic action for you to utilize. And then you get, obviously, there's a scale from high to low. So you get grains which are very low in diastatic power. Sorghum might be a good example of that. Obviously, your caramel malts and your specialty malts are virtually zero because all the enzymes have been removed. And then finally, the final concept, I hope you're still all okay, you're surviving this, is mash efficiency. You will also hear experienced brewers talk about mash efficiency. And that is really, there's a way of calculating, obviously. I'm not going to show you that, don't worry. It's a complicated calculation at the best of times, but it is really just a measure of the degree of sugars extracted by your mash process. So you can imagine that any given quantity of grain will have a maximum possible amount of sugar you can convert or extract, right? By mashing, by converting those starches into sugar. And that theoretical maximum extraction point is what's used to calculate your mash efficiency. So it's going to be based on the pre-boil gravity you're going to measure. So if you do your gravity measures with your hydrometer or refractometer, right before you start boiling your wort, you're going to take that figure divided by the total maximum extraction, which is the theoretical number, and that percentage will be your mash efficiency. Now, you don't have to do that by hand. There's lots of calculators online in brewing software and other places to do that for you. In fact, I'm actually going to be publishing that calculation on the Beginner Brewer website soon as well. You can go there with the calculator section. And it's usually a percentage upward from, 60% upwards. And we're going to talk a little bit about that figure because it can become important for people. And it is one of the common myths, I think, around what you're aiming for when you're doing all-grain brewing. Okay. So here's a warning. There's some science ahead. I couldn't help it, but I warned you. So now we can go on. First, let's figure out what yeast does. It's sort of, I was trying to think through what's the best way of explaining all-grain brewing and what's happening here in the mash and so on to people, which won't be too confusing, because I was often explained these things early on in my brewing career in very confusing ways. And it took me a while and a lot of reading to figure out what people were talking about. And I think one of the best ways to start is to start with the question of what does yeast do? I know it sounds like weird because we're way past the mash process when we're talking about yeast, but you have to understand what your endpoint is sometimes to know where you want to start with. So let's look at this carefully. So brewing yeast is of the Saccharomyces strains of yeast. Yeast is a fungus, by the way. So that's the category of organism it is. So fungus are one of those funny categories. They're not technically alive. They're sort of halfway between things which are considered not alive and alive. But it's a fungus, and it's a very beneficial fungus, obviously. And you get two main strains of Saccharomyces. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Saccharomyces pasteuralis. And those are the lager and the ale yeasts, which people know. There are other yeasts which are also used in beer brewing. So wild yeast, for instance, are also there. I didn't put them in here because they do much the same, but they're a little bit more complex. So I'm not going to deal with it today. But mostly, if you're going to be brewing beer at home, you're going to be using some version of a Saccharomyces yeast. And what does it do? Well, it eats up sugars to produce CO2, alcohol, and flavor compounds. And in previous webinars, I spoke about the tremendous contribution which yeast makes to flavor in beer. So you must never, ever underestimate the contribution. Up to 70% in some beer styles will be the yeast flavor, which you're really tasting. So what does it do? Yeast really likes converting simple sugars into these byproducts, CO2, alcohol, and flavor, which makes beer. Often brewers will say, we don't really make the beer, we just get out of the way of the yeast, which makes the beer. And that's very much the case. You just need to, your role is to create an environment for the yeast where it can be at its optimum state to create beer for you. And it does so through converting or eating simple sugars. That's its primary food, that and oxygen, which is why you oxygenate your beer before you pitch the yeast. And it's particularly bred and good at converting simple sugars. So maltose and dextrose are the ones which are mostly beneficial for it. There's some snazzy chemical constructions there for you to chew on. Don't worry, to be a good brewer, you do not have to remember those things. But it's important to understand what differentiates a simple sugar like maltose and dextrose from other sugars. So maltose is the sugar found in malt. It's essentially it's a combination molecule of two dextrose molecules stuck together, or glucose molecules in a very specific arrangement. So it's that top one there. And the bottom one is the chemical structure of dextrose or glucose. Those words are, by the way, interchangeable. Mostly Americans use the word dextrose. Non-Americans tend to use glucose. So it's very well evolved and bred to convert these kinds of sugars into what we want to create beer. What it's not so good at would be the other kinds of sugars. It's not very good at converting the so-called long chain sugars. So that's a dextrine, which is, annoyingly close to the word dextrose, and maltodextrin, and other kinds of long chain sugars. Not very good at converting those. It isn't well evolved to break them up into the basic sugars it needs to create alcohol and flavor compounds and CO2. There are some sort of interstitial kind of sugars. Sucrose, so table sugar, is not exactly a long chain sugar, but it's not exactly a simple sugar either. Sucrose, by the way, is a combination of glucose and fructose. So it's a sort of a mid-range sugar in terms of the complexity of its molecular chains. Saccharomyces yeast not too good at breaking those up into basic constituents. It can, but it's not as efficient. So there's a spectrum here, but for simplicity's sake, we'll stick to these three categories. And that's why, so dextrine and so those things, you can also, maltodextrin is often in the form of a malt. You get, dextrin malt, which can be used to make sure there are sugars in your beer which cannot be fermented. And there's reasons why you want to do that, and I'll get to that later. Lactose is another common sugar used in a very common style for South Africans, as it turns out, which is milk stout. So if you've ever had a castle milk stout, the fact that milk stouts are sweet to the palate, or sweeter than many other styles of beer, is because you add milk sugar, lactose, to it. And lactose cannot be fermented, cannot be converted by yeast, by Saccharomyces yeast anyway. It leaves it well alone. It's too complex a structure for it to break up into simple sugars, and so it stays in the beer, and that adds body and sweetness to the eventual product. This whole equation I'm showing you on the slide, by the way, also explains a very common infection, which some of you may have experienced in your beer, or hopefully not will, but almost certainly will, and that is wild yeast infections. A lot of wild yeasts are very good at not only breaking up simple sugars, but also long chain sugars. So it makes them different from your Saccharomyces strains. And when they do that, then you can imagine what's going to happen to your beer is every single sugar in that beer, because beer will contain long chain sugars and simple sugars. But if you have a wild yeast infection, and this often happens while you're bottling, it may actually convert all the sugars in the beer to CO2 and alcohol. And that's really bad. And you'll know you have that infection when you open your bottled beer and the entire contents of that beer empties, mostly into your ceiling because of the pressure it's under. And if that ever happens to you, or if it might not be that dramatic, although I've personally experienced that. So I, unfortunately, shamefully can tell you that I've personally, dressed my ceiling with beer. It may still just bubble over. And when you taste beer which has been infected by that wild yeast, it's interesting because it's not an off flavor like some of the off flavors. It just tastes like water. And the reason for that is there's no sugar in that beer. There's no flavor in that beer because everything has been converted to something else through the wild yeast. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, now that we know what yeast does, it makes much more sense to look at what mashing does. What are we really doing when we're mashing our grains? Well, we're taking a base grain, okay, and that can be usually the base grains will be diastatic grains, so they've got lots of enzymes in them, but you will also add your non-diastatic grains in the mash as well. because it's more efficient that way. It's not going to harm your mash to do that. And in fact, sometimes you want your non-diastatic grains to be part of this equation because you want, if they have starch in them, you want to convert that starch. So if you're using sorghum or maize or some of the oats and rye grains which haven't been modified, you want that diastatic power to help convert their starches into sugars. If you're using specialty grains, they don't have to be mashed, but you're going to add them into your mash anyway because you still want to extract their sugar and flavor. Then you can add water. Okay, makes sense. You need water. Water is the universal solvent, and that's what's going to release the enzymes in the base grains into the mash. Okay, so that's the role of water. The enzymes will then be released. And then you add heat. So like in many chemical reactions, heat is an ultimate catalyst. And it turns out that these enzymes are used to convert starch into sugar and some other things, which we'll get into now, requires some form of temperature, some form of heat. And the temperature ranges are kind of important in this whole equation. And time. It doesn't happen instantaneously. This is a biochemical process. It's a slower process than you may imagine. So it takes time and to accomplish what you're trying to achieve. And then all of that will eventually result in you creating both fermentable and unfermentable sugars. So the mashing process does create simple sugars, but it also creates long chain sugars. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that just now. And also proteins. So it's breaking up, some of the grain proteins into amino acids. So that's the building block of a protein. But some of those proteins do not break up through mashing and will remain there. And that's why boiling is so important. Boiling actually does, the job of breaking up a lot of proteins into its constituent parts so that it doesn't affect your beer flavor later on. So let's look a bit at enzymes. So this is also the sciencey part. Do apologize, but it's actually pretty simple if you stick with it. So what's happening in mash and what are the enzymes released by grain? Again, this is the magic of grains. They already have these enzymes in them. You don't have to add them or anything artificially. You just really need to, make it work by adding water and time and heat. But they all work at different ranges of temperature, also different pH levels. Okay. So right at the bottom of the temperature range, you get these two enzymes, beta-glucanase and protease, and they work. Beta-glucanase is from 35 to 45 degrees Celsius, protease 45 to 55. And those blue numbers are the pH ranges, which don't worry too much about them now. Now, beta-glucanase, that enzyme in grain, helps to break up cellulose, which is found in grain. So cellulose is often found in the husk of a grain, and it makes things kind of gummy. That gumminess you find, it's like making oats, that sort of, slightly creamy, gummy, nature of oatmeal is in all grains, and it breaks that up if you keep it at that temperature. Okay, protease breaks up the larger proteins, so it's very, very good at helping with reducing haze and increasing head retention in your beer. So for those of you who don't know, head retention is how if your foam in your beer is stable, or does it just disappear? So often if you've got too many big proteins left in your beer after fermentation, it could be a problem with head retention. And obviously the big proteins are visually, they're big, they can be seen. So they will create haze in your beer. Now, if you're mashing in at lower temperatures like these, you can do a lot towards reducing that. But there is a very big but here. So don't worry too much about these temperatures. But I did want to show you all the different ranges which enzymes operate in. But I'll get to them in more detail a little later. The ones we're really interested in as brewers, though, would be these two. The first one is beta amylase. And beta amylase is the primary enzyme which is responsible for converting starch into simple sugar. So as you might imagine, when scientists started understanding these processes, this was the one which brewers really focused on, because we know yeast needs simple sugar to survive and to produce the things we want to do to create beer. And so this temperature range is very important for brewers. So anywhere between 55 and 66 degrees Celsius. Okay, and the pH range is also higher, as you can see there, 5.1 to 5.3. Just for those of you who may have forgotten some of that school science, 7 is neutral. Okay, so typical distilled water should be a pH of 7, and the lower you go down, it's more acidic, and the higher is more alkaline. And a lot of mineral water, for instance, would be more alkaline, more alkaline than 7. Okay, so that's the first temperature range to be aware of. And this is one of the first variables which you need to try and control when you're doing all-grain brewing. You want to keep the temperature of your mash in this temperature range at least, so that you can produce a lot of simple sugar in order to make the basic wort, which will eventually be turned into beer. Then the next one up is a little bit higher temperature. So it starts at around 67 to 72 degrees Celsius. And that's the other enzyme called alpha amylase. And alpha amylase produces both simple and complex sugars. And so the difference here really is in terms of body. Remember I said earlier that you can control the body of your beer through the amount of sugar in it. If you create a lot of complex sugars in your wort through this mashing process, so if you mash at a very higher temperature, let's say at 70 degrees, it means that there will be simple sugars being created by alpha amylase, but also a lot of complex sugars. Now, those complex sugars are not going to be fermented or converted by the yeast. Okay, they're going to stay in the beer, and that contributes body. So ultimately, the human palate perceives those sort of sugars in beer as body. It will feel like there's more body in the beer. It obviously will be sweeter because those sugars are sweet to the taste and they'll remain in the beer. But generally, because you use hops and those other things, it won't be as discernible. And so it will finish more sort of cloying on the palate, not in a bad way, but it will have a longer finish in that sense. Whereas if you mash at a lower temperature, let's say you're mashing at 65, you're going to produce a lot of simple sugars, not a whole bunch of complex sugars. Those sugars are going to be fermented by your yeast, so your beer is going to end up drier to the palate. It's going to have a higher alcohol content, and it's going to have a lighter, thinner body. Okay, so now you can start seeing where the complexities of mashing come in and why it is such a cool thing to play with, because for different styles of beer, you may want different levels of sugars in that beer style. If you compare, for instance, a typical English bitter or English ale to something like a lager, the English ale is much sweeter. It's got a much heavier body than something like a lager, which tends to be very dry, very crisp in its finish, very light in its body. So you can see how brewers who brew those different styles would have mashed differently. Your lager brewers mash in at lower temperatures. They want a lot of simple sugars so that they can have a nice dry beer. Your English brewers who want to have that fruity, heavier ale will be mashing in at higher temperatures because they want more complex sugars, more body in their beer. So that's really what the main manipulation you can achieve through mashing. Now, you might notice, if you're high attention to detail, and well done if you did, there is a gap. So there's a gap between 66 and 67, and in that gap is where a lot of brewers tend to mash in. And it's usually about 66.5 or 66.7, because it's sort of right in the middle of those two ranges. And if you do that, you get a good mixture of alpha amylase activity and beta amylase activity. So there is some overlap here. And that will give you a moderate bodied beer, which 80% of beers would call for that sort of body. You want a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of body, but you also want the crisp, dry finish at the end. And obviously you need fermentables to create alcohol. So the middle point there is what many, many different brewers would use as their main mash temperature. Just keep that in mind. And keep those questions coming, by the way. Thanks for those. And you can see the pH differs a little bit here. Now, also, if you pay attention to detail, you'll see that there's a big overlap in these pHs. They're not that different. Okay, keep that in mind for later. Because there's some myth busting here. So the thing I've noticed in monitoring a lot of these homebrew channels on Facebook and other places, and I really do enjoy them, and I'm part of them, and I encourage you to be part of it as well. And kudos to the people who've started those. But the problem I have sometimes with these is as soon as people start talking about all-grain brewing especially, there's always some expert who comes out of the woodwork to try and frighten you about how complex this is going to be. And they will say things like, "Oh, you have to hit every single one of those steps. Oh, you better measure your pH. If your pH is wrong, it's going to be a disaster," and so on and so forth. And it really isn't, because again, as I've said before, if it were really that complicated, then ancient Babylonians and ancient Sumerians couldn't possibly have made beer. Okay, it just wouldn't have happened. And even, you don't have to go back that far. Your 18th century brewer who didn't have biology as a subject, it wasn't invented yet, could make good beer. Why? Because it's not that difficult. Okay, so you got to temper some of that stuff. I think that sometimes people like throwing their weight around on these platforms due, I don't know, various reasons. But don't get fooled by it. I think there are more simple things to worry about than some of these things I hear and see on homebrew channels and forums. And some of them I've collected here. So let's go into some myth busting. The first one I mentioned is, you must hit every step in the mash schedule. So these mash steps and the different enzymes active in grains are well known by people who've read a couple of brewing books. Palmer's book on how to brew is probably the most famous. You can find it for free on the internet. He has the whole schedule there. And so they wrongly believe that you have to go through all the steps. That is incorrect. Okay. Why is that incorrect? So it's a myth. And single infusion mashing, which is the name for a mash which you use only at one temperature, it's a single temperature, is fine. In fact, if you go to a lot of craft brewers around the world, that is the most commonly used mashing technique around the world for commercial brewers, is single infusion. It's simple, it's easy. You don't have to control the temperature of your mash tun. You don't have to worry about adding heat and so on. And why does it work? Well, if you keep your infusion temperature at something which will either benefit alpha amylase or beta amylase, you will get everything you need. The protein content of modern malts is quite low. In fact, that is sort of part of the commercial benefit which a maltster will try and sell you as a commercial brewer. When I was doing a lot of commercial brewing, that's part of their sales pitch, is they'll say, my pale malt's got very low protein content. Okay, because we make it like that. And so that's part of the the wonder of modern malting processes. The malts are incredibly well modified, so they've got lots of diastatic power, and more we're getting now the technology to malt non-traditional grains. So non-barley grains are increasingly also being malted, meaning their starches are being activated. They come already with a lot of starch in them, so well modified in that sense. So things like rye and oats, even you get malted rye, malted oats, and increasingly I just see more and more of those being made available. So even in non-traditional grains, we have well modified grains, and because of that, a single infusion mash will often do exactly what you need it to do. It will have enough sugar available and not as much protein, which will result in haze or any of the other issues which the older ways of manufacturing malt may have caused. So that's really the short of it. I mean, you can go talk to any commercial brewer and they'll tell you the same thing. Modern malting processes just make single infusion mash the easiest possible method, and you don't have to go through a step mash anymore like you may have done back in the 18th century. But step mashing can be useful. Is that true or a myth? It is true. It obviously still has a place in brewing. You will find some commercial brewers who do use step mashing, but they're doing it for a very specific purpose. They're not just doing it because it's there. And the main purpose you still might be using step mashing is if more than 25% of your grain bills, in other words, all the grains you add to your beer, is composed out of unmalted grains. So if more than 25% of your grains are flaked oats, flaked wheat, flaked barley, raw rye, corn, which is sort of ungelatinized corn, those sort of grains are so unmodified that they are going to have a lot of protein in them still. In fact, a lot of the malting process and the initial conversion processes in manufacturing malted grains is to remove a lot of that protein. So if you're going to use a lot of these unmalted grains, you will need to use the mash to break up that protein. So if I'm going to make a beer with a lot of these kinds of grains in them, I might consider having a protein rest, for instance, right? So just to, to remind you, that's one of the lower temperature rests. And I might, rest that for 20 minutes or so, 20 to 30 minutes to break up some of that protein before I raise the temperature to a temperature which is good for alpha amylase or beta amylase. But it's rare. And like I said before, you really don't have to use these grains anymore. There are good modified versions of them available for brewers. But you certainly can experiment with step mashing. It has other benefits, though, which are much more interesting for commercial brewers. And I think maybe that's the other reason why you do get some of these self-appointed experts on homebrew forums who sort of insist that you have to use them, because they've seen commercial brewers use them, but they don't know why. They just have this sort of mantra on their heads to say, well, if a commercial brewer uses it, then I must use it. And that's not a great idea, because, I mean, I'm sure I don't have to point out to you that, if you go and visit a craft brewery and you look at what the equipment they bring on and the equipment you're brewing on, they're two different things, right? You're not making 1,000-liter batch at a time. You're not using hundreds of kilograms of grain and so on. And a lot of the benefits you can derive from step mashing are benefits which you won't really see as a home brewer. So things like you get maximum extraction, which is different from conversion, which means you're just utilizing that grain more efficiently. You get more flavor stability sometimes in some of these step mashing processes. Now, those things seem as though you may want them as homebrewers, but if you look at the practicality of it, you probably don't. Flavor stability is only an issue if you're going to be keeping your homebrew for very long periods of time on a shelf somewhere, like many brewers would if they're selling their beer. As a homebrewer, let's face it, even if you brew quite a lot of beer, 20 liters, 30 liters at a time, your beer is not going to last that long. Hopefully not. You're going to be giving it away and drinking it yourself. And the efficiency equation is only an issue if you are buying tons of malt at a time. If you want to get fired as a commercial brewer, then, you start becoming wasteful and people are going to look at you funny, because there's so much money involved in buying that much ingredient and not utilizing it as much as you can. But if you're buying 5 kilograms of pale malt and you're making 20 liters of beer, that's not really a massive issue. So I hope that I've clarified that. I hope that you won't feel too anxious about not doing step mashing, although in Brew-in-a-Bag you can. It's actually not that difficult to use step mashing procedures in Brew-in-a-Bag, but it's not necessary. The other big one is water pH, those little blue blocks I showed you earlier. And that's really a headache for many people who get into this, because they think, wow, how am I going to measure pH? Do I have to buy a pH meter? You can. Digital pH meters are expensive. You can buy the pH papers, but not all of them are the right kind. It can become complicated. But is it true? No, it's not. Why? Because malts are naturally acidic. Beer wants to be made, yet again. By adding malts to water, you are actually acidifying the water already to the correct pH range. There's also a big overlap between all those steps I showed you, and it's between 5 and 5.3. So it's very likely that if you just use a typical malt bill of pale malts and other kinds of specialty malts and so on, that you will acidify the water to the extent that it's exactly the right range of pH for the enzymes to work properly. Again, it's almost like magic, isn't it? That everything's there for you. It's already done for you by just adding malt to water and heating it up. So it's very rare for you to actually have to adjust the pH of your water when you're doing all-grain brewing. There are sometimes cause for that. So if you're making very light beers, meaning there's very little in complexity of malt, so maybe you're only using pale malt. Pale malt is not as acid as some of the other malts. In fact, the more dark the malt, the more roasted the malt and so on, the more kilned the malt, it is more acidic. So your lighter malts are not as acidic. So then your pH might be a little bit, too high. And then you could lower the pH of the water. You can do that either by adding things like lactic acid, or there's actually a malt called, I can't pronounce it, it's very difficult, acidificated malt. I always get it wrong, but it's a very acidic malt, which you can add in small quantities to make your water more acid, your mash more acid. But it's very rare that you need to do that. I've brewed a lot of light beers, never had to use it. I have never in the since 2003 when I started brewing, have ever adjusted the pH of my water. Now, that might just be because I'm lucky that my municipal water supply here in Johannesburg is just the right kind, but it's unlikely because there's a lot of variation between municipal waters, mineral waters, and so on, tend to be a little bit more alkaline. Even so, I mean, if you're going to be adding 4 to 5 kgs of malt to 26 liters of water, that's going to be enough malt to acidify that water sufficiently for the mashing to take place. If you have boreal water, which you know for a fact is incredibly alkaline, maybe it's very hard water, lots of minerals, lots of alkalinity, you may want to consider, if you're getting bad mash results, to lower the pH of the water. But generally speaking, you don't have to worry about it. The other big myth is that you must have maximum mash efficiency, sort of like, and sometimes I have seen that at homebrew clubs where the brewers almost like brag about how efficient their mashes are. You know, I got 95%. It's incredible. That's fine. I mean, well done. Now what? You know, mash efficiency is only one part of the equation. And I don't think that's as important as knowing your efficiency. Okay, that's actually more important. Because if you know the general efficiency of your brewing setup, you will know how to adjust your recipe. So the more efficient your mash, the lower quantities of grains and everything you'll be using. And the less efficient, you'll just need to up your quantity of grain in your mash to account for the lower efficiency so that you still hit the recipe numbers. I mean, if it's very low, you should probably investigate why it's very low. Maybe you're using old malt, maybe your temperatures are not right, maybe the pH of the water is actually very, very weird. There's many reasons for low, very low mash efficiency, but very low is sort of under 60%. Again, very rare for you to have that happen. By accident, you can have a higher efficiency than that. Brew-in-a-Bag is actually a less efficient mash than some other methods. So in Brew-in-a-Bag, you would expect slightly lower. So in my experience, Brew-in-a-Bag efficiency varies between 68% to up to 80%. So it's a pretty wide range. Right now, the other day when I brewed a beer, I measured mine at 75. That seems to be sort of an average for me in Brew-in-a-Bag. But more importantly, if you know your efficiency, you can plug that efficiency into your recipe. And if you're using stuff like Beersmith brewing software, or if you just have a spreadsheet where you can calculate it, it'll help you make your recipe adjustments. But there's no one's going to give you a prize for having a 95% mash. I promise you that. Okay, let's get started quickly on, our time's almost up, but I wanted to show you, and I'll have other webinars in the future where I go into greater detail on Brew-in-a-Bag and how to formulate recipes and all that. I just wanted to show you some of the basics about how it works. And it really is very basic. As the name suggests, you're going to need a bag. I know that seems wildly exciting. So it's really simple. You need a bag. Okay, it's a very specific kind of bag, and this is a good picture of one. By the way, this is also a nice picture of base grain, which has been milled, and you can see those little white kernels are the actual pieces of starch, and the beige parts are the husk of the pale malt. So it's a nice photo of that. So what are you going to need? You will need a couple of things. You'll need a stock pot for a full volume boil and mash. So if you're going to be brewing 19-liter batches, which is common, you'll be needing a stock pot which can take at least 30 to 35 liters of water comfortably. And a stock pot is one which is taller than it is wide. Okay, that's important. You don't want to be using those really big, wide ones for mashing, they're fine, but for boiling, they're not. So I guess if you want to make life difficult for yourself, you can have two pots, but I would not recommend that. And in fact, the whole point of Brew-in-a-Bag is you use one pot for everything, and that makes it super convenient. You're going to need a voile bag. So the fabric it's made out of is called voile. It's a polyester fabric. It's also got cotton in it as well, I think. And it's the primary fabric used for side curtains. And so you can go and get it at any haberdashery. If you know someone who's handy with a sewing machine, they can probably make one up for you. You can buy it from a homebrew store. So they will sell them. And the size of the bag needs to be big enough to comfortably fit inside of your bag. And as you can see from the photo here, it needs to be bigger so that you can fold the bag over the rim of the pot so it doesn't fall in when you add the grains, right? So you want to have a comfortable size. Another good way of testing whether your voil bag is big enough is whether you can actually put your entire stock pot inside of the bag. So if you can use your bag to carry your pot in, you know it's big enough. Okay. You also know it's strong enough if the pot doesn't, tear its way right through the bag. So that's another thing. So if you are going to make it yourself, double stitching, those sort of things, it's going to carry a lot of weight. The bag should be able to carry at least 8 kilograms at most. And if you're going to make those real heavy double IPAs and imperial stouts, you may be working with up to 8 kilograms of grain. So it needs to be able to carry that. Okay. You are going to measure. So in my previous webinar where I talked about equipment like nice to haves and so on, I mentioned that hydrometers are nice to have in extract brewing, but not necessary. In all-grain brewing, they kind of are. I wouldn't want to do it without it. You have to measure your gravity before you start boiling to know if you've extracted enough sugar in order to make the beer you want to make. And for that, you can really not have anything other than a hydrometer or a refractometer. And since temperature, by now you must have clued in that temperature is really, really important. So you've got to be able to measure that with a thermometer. So measurement becomes really important in this method. And then finally, you need to mill your grains, either by buying a grain mill. They are a bit expensive, and especially the good ones are pretty pricey. We're talking about upward of a couple of grand. Or you can ask your homebrew store to pre-mill it for you. Pre-milling has great advantages. I mean, you don't have to worry about it. And often the homebrew stores have their mill dialed in to be just the right size milling. Whereas if you buy your own, you've got to dial it in yourself. But obviously, there's pros and cons to everything. The mill itself is very important. So the fineness of the mill. It must not be, I see one of you asked the question, thanks for that. It shouldn't be flour-like. If you're making flour, well, you can make bread out of flour, but you cannot make beer out of flour. In fact, that's what's going to happen. If you mill the grain so fine that it's in fact like a flour and you put it in water, it's going to do what flour does when you put it in water. It's going to create like a dough, and that's not going to work. You cannot make beer out of dough. You can make bread out of dough. So I mean, you can always convert it into a bread, I guess. That's about the best you can do with that sort of disaster. But the idea is very much like this photo. Is you can see it's cracked, okay? And it's the right size milling is if you look at the milled grain. For one, 80% of the starch and the husk should still be together. So if you have a situation where all the husks are lying basically at the top and all the white kernels of starch are lying at the bottom, so there's complete separation between these two things, you're probably milling it too finely. You need to dial it slightly up from there so that it's okay if some of it, separates, but there should still be a kind of a combination of husk and starch together in one object, if you like. So you're really cracking it. It is cracking. That's really, so milling is probably the wrong word because milling makes me think of creating flour, but you're really cracking the grains. So you don't want to flour. Also, of course, the opposite is true if you're not milling enough. So if 80% of your grains are uncracked, so they're still whole, you're also not going to do anything. There's no enzymatic action in that because the enzymes cannot escape the husk. That's why you're cracking it. You're cracking it to expose the starch to water, but you're also cracking it to expose the enzymes, to release the enzymes found inside of that kernel to the water so it can do its thing. So that's important. You cannot get away from the need of milling your grains. Okay, so here's the step-by-step in Brew-in-a-Bag. Okay, water prep. For a 19-liter batch, you will need more water. Why? Because there's going to be something called grain absorption. The grains are dry, or somewhat dry. They're going to absorb a lot of your water initially. It's not going to come out again, so you need to start with more water than you need. So for a 19-liter batch with a typical grain bill, this will vary. You start at around 26 liters of brew water. Okay, and your target temperature is also going to be higher than what you actually want for your mash. I mean, rather the other way around. Your water you're going to heat is going to be higher than your target temperature. Now, again, remember from what we said previously, depending on the temperature, you're going to be sort of advantaging different kinds of enzymatic activity. And the reason why your water temperature will drop is just simple physics. Your grain is going to be at room temperature usually, or even at fridge temperature if you stored it in the fridge. and so it will lower the water temperature. So that's why we start higher. Again, these numbers are very sort of generic numbers. You're going to have to experiment a little bit yourself with different recipes. Again, there are calculators out there which help you. So if you're going for a full-bodied, let's say English ale, you want to start mashing at a higher temperature of 69, you're going to be starting at 74. Medium, your target is 66.7, which is the classic single infusion temperature which most brewers use because most beers are okay at medium body. And if you're doing a light-bodied lager or you're doing a high-alcohol Belgian beer or even some IPAs, which you want a lighter body in, you want to start at a lower temperature. Okay, so that's now dependent, as I said, on grain weight and temperature, but this is sort of numbers which will work for most middle-of-the-road beers you bring. Okay, then you're going to prepare your grains. So you're going to mull to just crack, like I said before. You'll mix all the grains together. You don't have to separate them in the way you're going to add it to the mash. You'll just mix them all together. That includes your specialty grains, like your caramel malts and so on. You'll just mull them all together, and no problem. And then you're going to put the bag in your water, which is at the right temperature, and then you're going to put the grains in that bag. So you're going to carefully pour the grains into the bag, and as you add it, you'll stir it into the water. And that's to prevent dough balls from forming. Okay, you'll see even the professional brewers and the commercial brewers, they have something called a grain hydrator. If you've ever seen someone mash in a commercial brewery, you'll see that it actually mixes water in as the grains fall into the mash. And that's, again, for the same reason. You don't want any dry patches where no enzymatic action will occur. The nice thing about Brew-in-a-Bag is you're using so much water that it's very unlikely that you will have dough balls forming. So you're pretty safe in that sense. But you can taste it with your brew spoon just to see if there's not any big clumps of dry grain. And then ultimately, you want to make sure that you've hit the right temperature. Now that the temperature has fallen, see if you should, by all accounts, usually be at the right temperature. You can make it higher, but not lower. So that means, if you've massively overshot the temperature, if it's way too hot, the problem is those enzymes which don't function at those hot temperatures would already have dissipated. So you can't fix that. You can make it higher, but you can't make it lower, in other words. So that's the only disadvantage of getting it massively wrong, but you won't if you're using a thermometer, right? That's why measurement's important. And then you're going to have to wait. Now you're mashed in. That's what people talk about when they say you're mashed in. Okay, and you're going to wait. Now time is the variable we need to control. We've got the heat sorted out, we've got the water, we've got the grains, the enzymes are doing their thing, and you're going to close the lid of your pot just to keep some of the heat in. Mostly because of the volume of water, it will maintain its temperature for long enough. You don't really have to add heat or keep it in a low flame situation because that probably will overheat your mash. So you can just keep it. If it's a cold day, you're doing this in winter, you can wrap some sort of insulation around your pot to keep the heat in. But I found even on a cold day, you're just using so much water that water is a natural insulator in and of itself. And so it won't lose that much temperature. And so for full-bodied, there's a different temperature range. Now, I'm sure you can start guessing already why that is. Because in a full-bodied beer, we want more unfermentable sugar, okay? And so your time is going to be shorter as we go, to more full-bodied beer because you don't want the time which it takes to create more converted simple sugars. So the shorter the time of the mash, the less simple sugars will be formed by the enzymes. And so your body of your beer will also be more full-bodied. So the light-bodied beers take the longest to mash. That'll be an hour and a half where you want maximum conversion of simple sugar. Okay. So these two variables, time and temperature, are the two main ones to think about when you're mashing. And now mash out is an optional step. That's where you raise the temperature to around 72. That stops the whole mashing process. Most of the enzymes we spoke of today will not function at higher temperatures than this. And so you're basically stopping enzymatic action, which means no more conversion takes place. This is optional. There's lots of debate in the homebrewing community and in the scientific community as to whether at these small volumes it makes any appreciable difference. I do it, but I have to admit I'm doing it for traditional reasons, not necessarily because I've got good data behind it. But generally, it'll stop the enzymatic action so that you don't over dry out your beer, for instance. And it does help a little bit with extraction. You're making the water less viscous, and so it will run out quicker, which might draw a little bit more of the sugar out when you do the next step, which is lautering and sparging. Brew-in-a-Bag couldn't possibly be simpler. You simply lift the bag. Okay, there's no recirculation of water. There's no fly sparging, which is where you would add water from the top. None of that stuff. You just simply lift the bag out of the water. You keep it there. If it's going to be very heavy, you might want to arrange something where you can, put it on a colander or something above the pot, and you just let it drain naturally. Eventually, there's lots of water in this grain, so you're going to stand it for an hour if you want it to be bone dry, which is not necessary. So you can always just put it in a separate bucket and let it drain happily on. You can add that stuff later to the brew, or you can do something else with it. But generally, that's all you need. That is the full, and that's why Brew-in-a-Bag is so convenient. You don't have anything complicated happening here. And then you're going to measure. Don't forget to measure. You're going to check your pre-boil gravity. All your recipes for all-grain brewing will have that number. And you want to try and get as close to the number as possible. If it's very low, it means that you didn't extract as much sugar as you may have wanted to. And you can adjust that by adding dried malt extract. Or if it's way higher, also possible, you can dilute with water before you start the boil. And beginnerbrewer.com has a calculator for this. You can enter all your numbers, and it'll tell you how much dried malt extract to add or how much water to add. So lots of calculators out there. And then everything else is the same. I'm going to zip through this. This is exactly the same as all the other methods. You're going to boil as normal. In all-grain brewing, chilling rapidly is a little bit more important because you are naturally going to have more proteins in your beer. It's just going, because you're using all grain, there's more bits of your grain still in the beer. Beg your pardon. Just take a drink of water here. I'll take a drink of beer later. But so rapid chilling to drop out some of those proteins are really important. Using finings like Irish moss in your boil, also more important when you're doing all-grain beer. And then when you pitch your yeast, same story as always. Again, here, cold conditioning your beer, if it's an ale, more important. So that's when the last 4 days or so before you bottle, cold crashing your beer. So taking it, putting it in a fridge, going right up to 1 degree Celsius, drops out more of those proteins. Simply, so in a way, all-grain brewing is a dirtier style of brewing, if I can use that word. You just have more undissolved protein because you've got those husks and everything playing a role in your brewing, which you wouldn't have in an extract brew. So you just need to be if you want nice, clear beer, you just have to do a little bit more to accomplish that. But again, it's not difficult. These are not, difficult procedure. Okay, I'm over time again, as always, but I'm going to try and address these questions. I hope you found some worth in this. I feel like I always rush through this, and hopefully we can go into more detail in future webinars. And I'm hoping to be able to run some face-to-face or virtual beer school type things where we can have much more time together and we can actually brew beer together. So I'll let you know about that as well. Let me address some of the questions. So first question, how do we tell what is a base and what is a specialty malt? Good question. Well, it's sort of not always stated, obviously, on the packaging or in homebrew stores. They sort of assume you know, right? I mean, and that's not very nice of them. Basically, there are far fewer base malts than specialty malts because you don't need as many. Now, the main base malts will be your pale ale malts, or also called pale malts. They're sometimes called 2-row pale, to distinguish them from 6-row pale, and that's just the rows of barley plant. Some barley plants have 6 rows, or others have 2 rows of kernels. And Pilsner malt is another base malt. Okay, so they're all pale. They all have one thing in common. They're all pale in color, so a light cream beigey color, and they are not sweet to the taste. They have only starch in them. And then some other base malts, in other words, malts which have diastatic power, which you can use in and of themselves to make beer, would be things like Munich malt and Vienna malt. Those are malts which are more kiln, so they are darker and they have more biscuity flavors, but they still have a lot of enzymatic action. So you can technically make beer almost exclusively from them, although that's not really highly recommended. Things like Cara Munich and so on are trade names. So Cara Munich is a Weyermann trade. Weyermann is a malting company. Their caramel malts, their crystal malts, which is a specialty malt, they call Cara Munich. I don't know why. It's very confusing. It confused the hell out of me when I started brewing with Weyermann malts, because it sounds like it's Munich malt, which is really not a specialty malt. It's very confusing. So I don't have an easy answer to that question. It's sort of experience which will teach you, but ask the homebrew store where you buy it from, right? I mean, that's the most important. Or ask me. I'm very welcome to drop me a line at contact@beginnerbrewer.com and I'll help you out. Okay, does flavor change if using liquid yeast, or I assume you're using dried yeast? Absolutely. Liquid yeast tends to have better flavor. More difficult to get hold of in South Africa, but I see more and more brew stores offering liquid yeast. You have more range of yeast as well, more varieties of yeast. So generally speaking, I prefer using liquid yeast if I can find it, but sometimes I can't, so then I use dried yeast. I also like propagating my dried yeast and reusing it. That will be a topic of a next webinar as well. Okay, access to natural spring water, which is very pure. Water quality obviously affects your beer tremendously, and if you want to use natural spring water, I would recommend having it tested. I know here up in Gauteng, Rand Water has testing facilities you can use. Like you can call them up and they'll tell you how to do it, and you'll give them a sample of the water and they'll analyze it for you. There might be some cost involved. I know other people like Apiwe from Brewster's Craft, she does testing like that for you as well. So generally trying to test the water for cleanliness. So mostly what you want to test is you want no bacterial content. Okay, and remember, you can't always taste that in the water. You need to have it tested. You also want to test it for heavy metals, anything dangerous, which you don't want in water. And chlorine and chloramine content should be pretty low if it's a natural spring. But yeah, there's all sorts of weird stuff in groundwater, unfortunately, because, if you dump chemicals upstream of your underwater aquifer, it's going to get in there. And so we don't know always what's in our groundwater nowadays. So best is to have it tested. If it's already being used to drink, if you're lucky enough to live next to guys who are already bottling it and selling it, I guess you are much safer, ground. I think we already treated how fine the grain must be mulled. Is it true that Brew-in-a-Bag grain needs to be mulled finer? No, it's not. The milling is pretty much what it is. You need to crack that grain open to the right degree to allow for the starch to be exposed, but the hole to still be around so that it can act as a natural filtration. And that's true in Brew-in-a-Bag as well, because you still want that grain husk to filter out some of the protein when you lift the bag out of the water, because otherwise it's just going to be very dirty. So no, you would not mold differently. You can lager your Pilsner for 6 to 8 weeks. There's a comment there. Yeah, so traditionally, old-fashioned lager making was a very long process. Lager is in fact German derivative of the word storing or storage, I think. My German's not that good, but I believe that it is. And so when you made lagers, you would age them in low temperatures for many, many weeks. Why? Because at low temperature, yeast is less effective. It takes much longer for the yeast to do what it's supposed to do, to convert all the sugar into alcohol and CO2 if it's cold. But the result of it is that because the yeast is working very slowly, it doesn't produce a lot of additional flavor. So it makes the lager or the Pilsner very crisp. There's very little fruitiness to it. The length of that activity conditions the beer. It integrates the flavors very well to produce that sort of classic, nice crisp bite with not a lot of fruitiness of a typical well-brewed Pilsner. So yeah, if you're going to do it traditionally, but very few brewers I know, home brewers and commercial brewers, actually follow that route. You can make a very credible lager nowadays with good, malts and hops and yeast in 2 to 3 weeks, really, by just also keeping the temperatures down, of course, to the right level. And for that, you'll need to control your fermentation temperature by either having a jacketed fermenter or putting your fermenter in a temperature-controlled fridge, or being lucky enough that the place in your house has the right temperature. But yeah, you can still make very good lagers in less than 6 weeks. That is a myth. That's such a great question. Can I squeeze the bag after 60 minutes or rather let it drip out? There is so much debate. You would be surprised to know how much debate and research has gone into this question. I've attended some very, very vociferous arguments between home brewers around this thing. I was taught when I started brewing by lots of experienced brewers that you must never ever squeeze any bag you put grain in, whether it's steeping specialty grains or brew-in-a-bag, because that squeezing action will extract tannin out of the grain. So tannin is a natural compound in grain, and it's the thing which makes tea taste like tea. In beer, it's almost always a flaw to have tannin in your beer. It makes it very unpleasant to the taste. It's a mouth puckering kind of sensation. And that's been the general received wisdom. I have, however, seen more and more people doing research on this, doing experiments where they purposefully squeeze the hell out of the bag versus not, and see if they can discern a difference in taste. And some of those experiments are starting to suggest that it doesn't make a difference. So that's one of those questions where I can't give you a definitive answer. I think there's good reasoning on both sides. To be cautious, I don't do it because there is no definitive data either way, so I'm rather safe than sorry. So I generally don't squeeze the bag, but maybe you should try it and give us some feedback on that. You know, it's the worst that can happen is your beer can just be a little bit more mouth puckering than normal. But I don't really know. The jury is still out on that one. Okay, I think that's it for everyone. Sorry I went over time. I see some of the guys already left to go to the pub, I hope, or to go and grab a home brew. That's it for today. If you have any more questions, anything at all, please contact me at contact@beginnerbrewer. I really do respond to those emails. You can also fill in a contact form on the website, beginnerbrewer.com. But reach out to me. You know, I'm on Facebook, Beginner Brewer, and I'm on Twitter as well. So any of those channels, I'm pretty good at monitoring them. I always get back to people, and I really don't mind answering any question, no matter how dumb you think it is. There are no dumb questions in brewing. There's just bad beer and good beer. That's all that matters. So until next time, in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be doing another webinar. Still see what the topic is. Have a great weekend. Go brew some nice beer and let me know how it turns out. Thanks, everybody.